Hurry, hurry, come, let's go. Time's no longer on our side. Get on board quickly, this ship is going far. Get your loved ones.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to week 4 of Sabbath School. But this week, we focus on a God who is much more personal and who hears and delivers us individually, personally. A father and a young daughter were walking back from daycare when she said to him out of the blue, "Daddy, I finally found a good question to ask my teacher." The father could hardly contain his enthusiasm because he knew his daughter was very smart. "Well, what is it?" he asked. She said, "Before we were here, in this body, where were we? Before being who we are, what were we?" The father said, "What did your teacher say?" "Nothing," replied the little girl. "She just stood there staring at me with her mouth open." The father praised his daughter for asking such a great question, but didn't answer right away. The little girl was impatient. "And where were we?" she finally blurted. Her father went down on his knees and lovingly asked her if she believed in God. "Yes," she replied. "And there's your answer," said her father. "Before creating you, God had to think about you. He probably said, I'm going to make a little girl like this and like that, with this hair, with these eyes, and with this smile. So before you were here, you were in the mind of God, because no one creates something without thinking about it first." That little girl was fascinated with her father's answer and walked the rest of the way in silence, deep in thought. We have all been in God's thoughts at some point before our existence, and God knows each of us in the most intimate way we could possibly imagine. Psalms 139 is probably the most intimate of the Psalms. Just listen to this. Verse 13. "You made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit them together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. It is amazing to think about. Your workmanship is marvelous, and how well I know it." Verse 15. "You were there while I was being formed in utter seclusion. You saw me before I was born and scheduled each day of my life before I began to breathe. Every day was recorded in your book. How precious it is, Lord, to realize that you are thinking about me constantly. I can't even count how many times a day your thoughts turn toward me. And when I waken in the morning, you are still thinking of me." Do you want to know God as intimately as He knows you? Why is feeling cared for such a big deal in relationships? Because feeling cared for ensures our survival, and it is to our heart what water is to our body. It is an essential part of our first moments of life here on earth. From the moment we are born, we need to be cared for in order to survive. Care as an infant means making sure it has a clean diaper, food, and nurturing love from their caregivers. The older we get, care takes on different forms, but a child learns about God's care from their parents and how their needs get met. It's part of that basic intimate relationship called attachment. Feeling cared for helps us feel connected in relationships. As a therapist, I can't even begin to tell you how many times I've seen people breaking down in tears, just utterly heartbroken because they don't feel cared for by their loved ones. And our relationship to God is no different. We won't feel connected to a God who watches us from a distance, as that popular song goes. So the psalmist goes out of his way to transmit to his readers in very specific ways how God shows His care for us in a personal way. It's in the daily stuff. One of these psalms is 121, which is part of what may have been recited during pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem. It's only 8 verses long, but it shows God's care in such specific details. For example, David says he looks to the hills longingly or with a deep desire to know where he's going to get help. And God shows up. One of the ways he shows care for us is by doing something that none of the other pagan deities did, and that is sleep. David knew that God was available 24/7, anytime. In fact, it was a common belief in the surrounding pagan religions that if you woke up a deity, you would have to deal with their wrath. But David says the opposite. God doesn't need to sleep. He's always looking out for us. If you had little kids, you know how important it is for their sense of safety and security to know that their parents are available to them when they wake up at night in the dark. They may call their parent from their room or walk to their parents' room and let them know that they need them for comfort. When their parents are consistently available to them in those dark hours, they learn to trust that their parents care for them. And we're God's children. It's the same thing. It's the same concept. Another image that David uses to let people know that God is intimately involved in our care is when he says that God is your shade at your right hand. Typically soldiers, the kind of crowd that David hung around, would hold their shield on their left hand in order to have their right hand free to do other things. But it would also leave their right side more vulnerable to attacks. So it was a good idea to have a friend or an ally close by on your right side to protect your vulnerable side. And God is that friend that has your right side, standing in the way of any potential threat. Just in case there's any doubt in the reader's mind, David tries to cover all other potential sources of danger. Day, night, coming in, going out, now, the present, all of the future. And that's how involved God wants to be in our lives. Every moment of every day. I can't think of any other being that would care so much about his creatures. And that's so reassuring. Today's lesson focuses on Psalms 114, which describes in very poetic language how God delivered Israel out of Egypt and into the promised land. The author delights in showing how the obstacles the Israelites were up against were absolutely nothing for God. He says things like, the mountains skip like rams, the little hills like lambs. The author even seems to taunt the natural elements such as the Red Sea and the Jordan River. Listen to what he says to these two bodies of water in the Living Bible translation. What's wrong, Red Sea, that made you cut yourself in two? What happened, Jordan River, to your waters? Why were they held back? Okay, so here's the thing. You and I are not currently in the same circumstances as the Israelites. We don't need to cross the Red Sea to save our lives from an army that is chasing us. So why would this psalm even be relevant to a present-day Christian in the 21st century? I believe the answer is that God is still the same God. He was with the Israelites thousands of years ago. Now he's capable of moving our proverbial mountain from our lives or parting those proverbial waters from our lives. God still has the same power and the biggest creativity in solving the problems you and I go through. In The Desire of Ages, Ellen White writes, "Worry is blind and cannot discern the future, but Jesus sees the end from the beginning. In every difficulty, he has his way prepared to bring relief. Our Heavenly Father has 1,000 ways to provide for us, of which we know nothing." As a poor university student, I will never forget how God providentially provided nutritious food for me one summer. I was living in an apartment in Argentina and food was scarce. But outside of my window, there was a thriving fig tree that had so many figs that they would fall to the floor and rot. So for the whole summer, I had a steady supply of fiber, magnesium, potassium, and even 0.3 grams of protein per fig. Right after the summer, and after moving into a new place, the owner chopped down the fig tree to make room for a new building. God didn't send me ravens as he did to Elijah, but he did send me a fig tree, just for me, for the time I needed it. And who would have thought? What's your story of deliverance? It may be big or small, but we would love to hear it in the comment section below. Psalms 91 is probably one of the most popular psalms associated to God's protection, care, and refuge in adversity. It is certainly one of the psalms that I have a personal connection to, and that got me through a very scary time in my life. You see, when we were living in South Africa, unfortunately, there was a lot of violence and we often felt unsafe, even in our own home. One such afternoon, my brother, sister, and I came home from school to find that our house had been ransacked. On another occasion, we came home from church after being away all day, only to find that our house had been broken into yet again, but this time more violently. One of the images I will never forget is how my bedroom window had been broken with a big rock that I found on the floor of my room, and the glass completely shattered, covering my entire bed. Obviously, a lot of things were stolen, but that wasn't the real problem. Because, material things can be replaced. But the sense of unsafety in your own bedroom was pretty traumatic for me as a teen. Robbers tried to break back into our house while we were even sleeping inside too. Needless to say, I was unable to go back to sleeping in my own room. Every night, I would ask someone in the family if they would take me in and allow me to sleep in their room. I would bring my mattress and put it on the floor and try to fall asleep, but I couldn't. I was just in such a state of fear. Now I understand that I was experiencing post-traumatic stress. I remember that every night I would take up my Bible and read Psalms 91 over and over and over again. And then when I had to turn off the light, I would keep on repeating it inside my head until I was finally able to fall asleep. It was the only thing that gave me some sense of comfort and protection and allowed me to fall asleep and stay asleep. I can just imagine David hiding in a cave or running for his life from King Saul and writing Psalm 91 when he had a chance. Now, Psalm 91 doesn't say that you won't have adversity or trouble, but it does say we can trust God to be our refuge in those times of trouble. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him I will trust. May you turn to Him as your refuge too. Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame is a classic French novel published in 1831. And if you haven't read the book, you may have seen an adaptation of the book to a play or the big screen. The author tells the story of a hunchback bell ringer, Quasimodo, who lived in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. He had been abandoned as a baby, and Quasimodo had been raised by Frollo inside the cathedral, although he didn't venture out into the city due to his deformity. At one point, he goes out to the Festival of the Fools, which is an annual celebration, and there he meets Esmeralda, who is another major character in the novel. She is the love interest of many men, but is quite a controversial character. At times she's adored and hated, and then at one time she's also accused of witchcraft. So she's sentenced to be burnt at the stake, and moments before she dies, Quasimodo rescues her by swinging into the scene with a rope from the cathedral, carries her back into the Notre Dame Cathedral, and cries out, "Sanctuary! Sanctuary!" He was claiming the law of sanctuary, which made her immune to arrest for whatever crime she was accused of. This religious custom in medieval Europe allowed fugitives to escape the death penalty because it was considered extremely inappropriate to carry out acts of violence, especially with weapons, inside a church. Interestingly, if the fugitive was not Christian when he asked for asylum in the sanctuary, it was expected that he convert to Christianity. The downside to claiming sanctuary was that the person was allowed to live, but had to be exiled because if they tried to go back into their community, they would probably be arrested and killed. Apparently, this law predates Christianity according to some historical records and was used even up to the 20th century in some parts of the world. The Psalms often reference the sanctuary as a place where our help comes from. Some Psalms call it Zion or Holy Hill, Pavilion or Tabernacle, or simply God's house. But the idea is always the same. Look at Psalms 27 verse 5, for example. It reads, "For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. On the secret place of his tabernacle he shall hide me. He shall set me high upon a rock." For David, the experience of the house of God was not a legal asylum-seeking place, but rather a place where he could meet with God and experience the beauty, truth, and goodness of God. If we look at verse 4 of that same chapter, David says he desires to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of his life and to behold the beauty of the Lord, to inquire in his temple. David is looking for that encounter with God, and a guaranteed place to find him is in his house. The presence of God provides safety, not the actual building. Of course, God is everywhere, and we can feel his presence in different settings. But there's something different about the act of going to God's house and encountering his presence there. So what's your experience in the house of the Lord? We would love to hear from you in the comments section below. Hello, my friends. We have come to the end of our week together, studying about how the Lord hears and delivers. Even though he is the King of the universe, he seems to have a personal interest in each human being, which is just baffling. He personally hears and delivers those that call on him. Throughout the Psalms, we have seen this week how he wants to be our personal refuge. But we have to also be realistic. Christians don't get a free pass for suffering and hardships. Because even though we do pray for protection from danger on the road, for example, there have been many accidents and even deaths of people who followed God with their whole heart and asked him for protection. So what happened? Why didn't God deliver them? Or there have been many times when Christians have been afflicted with terminal illnesses and did not survive, despite praying for healing and having faith that God would deliver them. What happened? What about the devout Christian who can barely make it paycheck to paycheck each month and then gets fired by a greedy CEO who wants to increase their profits by having less employees and overburdening the ones who remain? Where is God the deliverer there? I'm sure he hears his creature's plight, but where is the deliverance? And I wish I knew, and I wish I had a better understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. I don't have all the answers, but I can share with you what I do know. There is evil in this world, and Satan is the ruler of this planet for now. He creates problems and stirs up strife to afflict God's people. And in the process, we fall into the same trap as Adam and Eve fell, that of doubting that what God is saying is true. And that's how sin came into the world, by Adam and Eve not believing God when he said, "You will die if you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." Instead, Adam and Eve listened to the serpent, the enemy who told them otherwise. Still, to this day, Satan is trying to get people to doubt God's love, care, his word, and to blame him for the evil in this world. 6,000 years later, we're still falling into the same trap of doubting that what God says is true. If God says he is our refuge and deliverer, then let's trust him that he is. We can't see the end from the beginning, and God may not deliver in the way we thought he would, or even in this life. But we are not God. Let's not try to put ourselves in the place of God and think we have an explanation for everything, or understanding of everything even. I know it's easier said than done. And please join us next week through Lesson 5. God bless you.